To do semantic analysis, just to give you a little bit of introduction here, you have to understand what some of the issues are in lexical analysis or semantic analysis. We're talking about doing word studies. That's basically what we're talking about, word studies. For that paper, if you read the description of the syllabus, you are to choose 2 and only 2 Hebrew words out of your selected text to do word studies on. And you are limited in the amount of space you can give to them. You have a total, I believe, of 4 pages allowed. And so you better keep it concise and brief and to the point. And we'll be talking about a number of those issues, and we'll carry them on after we get through with Thanksgiving as well to talk about that. But you could start now, looking at your text, look for 2 words that you believe might prove fruitful to do a word study for. Select them. And then maybe even start doing a little bit of research. And that includes looking at theological dictionaries, like Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament, and the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. You can look at all of those, or NIDOT, New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. So there's a lot of things you can look at to help prepare for that paper and to be involved in. We'll be talking about it starting now and moving on through after the Thanksgiving break. The semantic sins to avoid are mentioned by Bob Chisholm in his book From Exegesis to Exposition in his discussions on pages 37 to 41. One of those is, don't read more than one semantic nuance of a word into any specific usage. In other words, words when we use them have a context. And the meaning that they take is determined by that context. It's not determined by its root meaning. It's not determined by how it's used somewhere else. It is determined by how it's used in this particular context. So don't take the meaning in a different context for the same word and say, well, I've got to work that meaning in also. Or go and find a third meaning in a third context. Well, I got to work that in, to where you're trying to make all 3 meanings apply to what you see in the text in front of you in this one context. That is what you call an abuse of lexical analysis. That is forcing other meanings upon the word which the writer or reader, or which the writer or the speaker never intended. So don't read more than one semantic nuance of a word into a specific usage. Second thing, don't assume there is a concrete word picture behind every abstract use of a word or phrase. Sometimes we love word studies because they give us something visual. Maybe it's a word being used in Psalm 51, kavas, which means to cleanse, which really means to beat out on a rock and wring out. That's how it's used. It's used of the old fullers or laundryman's vocation, where they take dirty laundry down to a pond or a river or a stream, and they would dip it in the water and get it wet, and then they would rub in some soap or some lye, and then they would dip it in the water again and wring it out, and then they'd beat it against the rock until all the dirt was out of the garment. Now that word happens to have a word picture like that with it that makes it very wonderful and something you can get very excited about, and it just builds something into your sermon. But relax. Only about 1 out of every 100 words in the Old Testament has a word picture like that. So don't try to find a word picture behind every single word. It's kind of like taking the word butterfly and trying to figure out, okay, where did that word come from? What does it do? And somehow or other we come up with some mythological story about butter flying. You know? And we don't have any idea why it was put together that way, that word. There's no inherent meaning to be derived or any concrete word picture from it. It's a waste of time to do that. Or to take the word enthusiasm and say, well, technically, it could be related to the word meaning in God. Well, I would imagine that if you ask anyone in America who used the word enthusiasm yesterday, if they had that word picture in mind, they'd say, are you crazy? I didn't even have any idea that there was any picture like that. Are you sure? And so for us to try to preach a message on that out of our supposed and imposed meaning is just short of twisting Scripture and putting a spin on it that we shouldn't be doing. So don't get into those traps. This is what Chisholm calls semantic sins. He says it's a sin to act this way with the text, to perform that kind of word study. Another, don't overextend or misapply a specialized meaning. We'll be looking at one of those a little bit later here. Be very careful of that. I mean, you get a word that has a very specialized meaning, and then we see perhaps a metaphor, and so we want to make the metaphor walk on all fours, and there was only one point to begin with, but we're trying to make it four. And so it's going to fall apart. Don't overextend or misapply. An example of word studies with regard to words like particles is given by Chisholm when he talks about the use of lema'an. Lema'an is a lamed preposition on a particle ma'an. It is used in two different ways. It's used to introduce purpose clauses, meaning in order that, or for the purpose of, and it's used with result clauses, so that, or with the result that. Okay? This particle, lema'an, compound particle, is found 270 times in the Hebrew Bible. And if you look it up in Halot, in the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, you'll find that it has the meaning of purpose when it is used with an infinitive construct. And this reminds us something about words. Never treat words by themselves. We talked about context, but now we're talking about something else. What is the word following that word? If you have a verb, what preposition is used with it after it? If you have lema'an, what form of the verb follows lema'an? That's what we call collocation. C-O-L-L-O-C-A-T-I-O-N. Collocation. Collocation means you have a collection, you have a gathering of a word group together that has a specific meaning. And you have to always pay attention to that. You don't look at one part of it and say, well, this is the meaning. You have to look at both parts because that's what determines the meaning. So lema'an, followed by an infinitive construct, has to do with purpose. So we look at Genesis 37:22. And as we're looking at this, we have, so Reuben said to them, do not pour out blood, cast him into this cistern, this pit, which is in the wilderness, and a hand do not send against him. He's talking about Joseph, and he's talking to his brothers. Then he says, lema'an hatzil. Hatzil is a hiphil infinitive construct from natsal. It means to deliver, to rescue. So how's lema'an being used here? It is purpose. It's telling us his purpose in saying this. He said this in order that, or for the purpose that, he might deliver him from their hand in order to return him unto his father. So lema'an followed by hatzil is talking about purpose, not result. We would not translate this with the result that he delivered him from their hands and returned him to his father. No, it's not talking about the result. It's talking about Reuben's purpose, his intent. And the reason we know that is the collocation of the particle with an infinitive construct. So always pay attention to those types of groupings and to how they're used both syntactically and lexically. Let's look at another one. Lema'an, when followed by an imperfect, normally has the idea of result. Now, here's a caution. If you read the lexicon carefully, you'll find out that the imperfect can also express purpose. So in reality, you can't be so simple in the division here and say, okay, if it's an infinitive construct, it's always going to be purpose. But if it's an imperfect, it's always going to be result, because some imperfects will be used for purpose as well. So context will have to determine there rather than the form. But let's take it where it does mean result. Let's take Genesis 18, verse 19. Because I knew him. The idea of knowing here is in selecting, choosing, electing. Because I knew him, Lema'an asher yitzaweh. Here you have an imperfect. You have a share here, but what a share does is it combines with Lema'an. So that which. It's almost like this is the so and this is the that. When you have a share used with Lema'an followed by an imperfect, you know that's always going to be result. If the share isn't here, you better look very carefully at the context. But when the share is here, that's going to be result. With the result that, because I knew him or I chose him, with the result that he might command his children and his household after him, and they might keep the way of Yahweh to do righteousness and justice. Now we have Lema'an with Havi. This is a Hifil infinitive construct. So this is purpose. So what God is saying here, I knew him so that as a result, I chose him so that as a result, he might command his children and his household after him, and they might keep the way of Yahweh to do righteousness and justice for the purpose that, in other words, for the purpose of bringing, or of Yahweh bringing upon Abraham that which he spoke concerning him. So there's the purpose. Here's the result. Here's the purpose. The result with a share and imperfect, the purpose with the infinitive construct. Those type of things we have to pay attention to. We have to read the lexicon carefully. We have to read the context carefully. And when we do a word study of Lema'an or Ma'an, we have to take that type of thing into account. Various contextual linguistic factors that come into play. If you look at Chisholm on page 36, he has a brief discussion of the word karath, which means he cut. He cut. And what he's going to say is that if we have the direct object of cut being body, flesh, meat, basar, or wood, it has one meaning. But if it has as its direct object berit, covenant, it takes a totally different meaning. Here's an example of collocation again. Here the collocation is the verb plus its object. Depending on the object, the verb takes a totally different meaning. When berit or covenant is the object of karath, it means to establish a covenant. It means to initiate a covenant. It is not the meaning of cut. Now, we sometimes like to say, but the reason for karath being used is because didn't they cut up a sacrifice like in Genesis 15 when a covenant is established? Yes, they did do that. Did they do that in every case? You're going to have a hard time demonstrating it. Where are the animal sacrifices that God sacrificed when he established the Noahic covenant? The only animal sacrifices those that Noah offered on the altar after he came out of the ark in order to thank God for the deliverance, and there's no indication that those are covenant sacrifices. And there are other covenants in Scripture too, of which there is no mention of any sacrifice, and indeed probably no sacrifice involved with the establishing or the initiating of that covenant, and yet the word karath will be used because it's used idiomatically. So watch what the direct object is. Then watch verbs plus prepositions. On the same page, he discusses the use of ana followed by the preposition beith in the sense of to testify against in Ruth 1:21. Now, if you look at ana all by itself, ana means to afflict. But whenever a beith preposition follows it, it never means afflict. It means to testify. To testify against. So here, the meaning of ana is determined by the preposition that follows it. That collocation must be taken into account. So if you're doing a word study of ana, you've got to deal with what its meaning is with that preposition and what its meaning is without that preposition. and they may be totally different meanings, as in this case. Yes?
These contextual factors, such as the debate there, they will be indicated in the reference words that we look up.
The lexicons will tell you.
So when we look up that word and say when used near this or with this.
Right, let me show you. It's a good question here. I'll go to the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon, and we'll go to Anah, and we'll take a look at it here. I love Libronics because of this. You know, having all these references together, I can take them anywhere in the world. No, I'm not a salesman. All right, here we go. We got Anah 309 times in the cow. And we go down through the source of thing here. We have the idea of reply or answer. And it says sometimes with reply or answer with a meaning, it's used with the preposition al. And we keep going on down through. You have reply of the opposition to testify, to give evidence with a lamed preposition. You have it with a baith preposition here, including Ruth 1:21. There it is, with baith for all of these verses. It has that idea. It's against, to testify against. And it can mean to respond to what was said and to allow oneself to be moved to answer, etc. You can go all down through. Then you have Anah 2 that can have the idea of to be wretched, emaciated, to cringe. You have Anah 3. Should be coming up down here somewhere. You have Anah 3, another homonymous root that means to be troubled. And you have Anah 4, and this is one that has the idea of to sing a refrain or to give a response. So when you're studying a word like Anah, you've got to look at every possible meaning, and you have to look at the possibility that there's more than one root. And so even though the word looks the same, it actually is originally from a totally different root and has a totally different meaning. And you always have to pay attention in lexicon what prepositions are used with it, and then what does it mean when that preposition is used with it. Yes, sir?
In our lexical papers, would you sort of recommend against studying words that are hapax legomena, just because?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Because it's a fruitless word study. And most of those is just because we probably don't even know the meaning to begin with, and there's no resources to find it. So I would, yes, steer away from hapax legomena. All right, let's look at another one. On page 37, he mentions the word yazeh in Isaiah 52, verse 15. And he says, traditionally, the verb yazeh, the hifil, has been understood as a causative of nazah, to spurt or spatter, and translated sprinkle. In this case, the passage pictures the Lord's servant in a priestly role as sprinkling or spiritually cleansing the nations. Though the verb nazah does occur in the hifil with the meaning sprinkle, there's one serious problem with the usual interpretation in all other instances where the object or person sprinkled is indicated. The verb is combined with a preposition like al or el. This is not the case in Isaiah 52, should be verse 15 there, unless one takes the following allow on him with the preceding line. But then one would have to amend the verb to a plural, make the nations the subject of the verb sprinkle, and take the Lord's servant as the object. Consequently, some interpreters doubt the cultic idea of sprinkling is present here. Some amend the text. Others propose a homonymic root meaning spring or leap, which in the hifil could mean cause to leap or startle, and would fit the parallelism of the verse nicely. And that's what he argues for. But there's a big problem here. The problem is he has said that nazah must have the preposition al or el following it in order to mean sprinkle. But the verb nazah occurs 24 total times in the Old Testament. And outside of Isaiah 52, verse 15, there are 5 more references where nazah has the obvious meaning by context of sprinkle, but without the preposition. So what he's done, he's not done a thorough analysis. He's misled us by making us believe that every occurrence of nazah that means sprinkle has a preposition, and therefore, since there's one absent here, you have to have a different meaning. And that's not true. There are 5 cases in which it occurs that way. The synonym, zarak, occurs 3 times in the Old Testament, also without a preposition. So be careful. You have to be very cautious of what goes on. Alec Motyer in the prophecy of Isaiah says, in his commentary, says it is odd, surely, to deal with one small novelty by importing a collection of others. And he's talking about bringing in the word startle, which is gathered from an Arabic word, which, by the way, does not have that meaning in all actuality when you check on it. BDB says it does. But if you find the Arabic dictionaries, and you talk to people, you find out it does not have that meaning at all. So be cautious, be careful. Don't import specialized meanings just because of a lack of thorough research and checking. There is no reason at all in this text in Isaiah 52:15 to take it any other than sprinkle. It should not be startle, regardless of what some of the English translations have done there. Semantic fields and synonyms. On pages 42 to 44, he has a fascinating discussion of the word ama and the word shifcha. Both of them mean a woman servant, a handmaiden. What's the difference between them? At first, when you look them all up, he spends about 3 pages discussing this. He says, at first, when you look these up, you get the idea, well, you know what? They're basically the same meaning. So there must not be any distinction. And so the writer must not be using them according to any distinction. But Chisholm rightly does a thorough analysis this time. And he looks through a number of different texts. And he discovers that Amma is the superior view of a servant that has some degree of dignity to it, whereas Shifcha has a lower degree and is used in speaking about oneself humbly. So Amma might describe your status to a friend. I am the Amma of someone, maybe someone great. But when you're talking to the person you're serving, you are their Shifcha, because you show a state of humility. Read his study carefully. This is one of the best studies on words that Chisholm gives us. And it's very thorough. He's accurate. He did not miss a thing. And it's a valuable distinction to make. We run across these two words a lot in the biblical text. Here you have a foundation for when you're preaching from a text that uses one of these words, you have an idea of the concept in the mind of the person that uses this word about the status of that individual who is a handmaid. So use Chisholm on that. It is very well done, and you ought to take a good look at it. He has on pages 44 to 47 another study where he's taking the word kavash, which means to subdue. And he says if one wanted to research what the Bible has to say about the current environmentalist debate, it would be important to probe the meaning of Genesis 1:28, where God says to the first man and woman, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." But what does that word subdue mean? He goes through a thorough analysis, and this is an exact way to do a word study. He goes through the cal usage, looking at every use of the cal. He looks at the nifal usage. He looks at the pel usage. What is he doing? He's trying to determine if there is a different shade of meaning in the different Hebrew stems, and to see if that sheds any light on the meaning of the word and how it is used in Genesis 1:28. And so he says, to bring under control of one's advantage is the basic definition. As a result, one can detect this general umbrella meaning behind the specific semantic nuances, which with the exception of Genesis 1:28 can be categorized as follows: to enslave, to conquer, to subdue, to molest, or to sexually assault. Now, in all of those, it's to bring under control for one's advantage. But notice it depends on the context, whether it's positive or negative. And in Genesis 1:28, it is obviously a positive context. Look who is speaking and when. Pre-fall, God himself saying the word to unfallen man. It's not the concept of the negative of enslave. It's not the concept of the negative to conquer and subdue it as though it's an enemy. It's not the idea of to molest or to sexually assault. It has a positive meaning. So here, even though the vast number of other uses have a very negative concept, the context of the use in Genesis 1:28 The speaker and the situation, historically and theologically, indicates that it must be taken in a positive sense. So you see, all that word study, all the way through, has produced only a general meaning elsewhere, but we have to reduce it further to come up with a meaning that fits in with Genesis 1:28. It's very interesting. He's done a good job there too. Now let's talk about what we do if we have a rare word. It was mentioned. What do we do? Should we have a word study for a hapax legomenon? That's a word that occurs only once. What do we do? Number one, these are called hapax legomena. That's the plural. Legomenon is singular. Hapax in Greek means one time. Legomena means spoken, literally. Spoken once. Said once. We examine derivatives in biblical Hebrew. Look at all the words related to it and related to the same root. What do they contribute toward understanding the meaning? If you have a root and it's found in various nouns and various verbs, look them all up and see if you can determine if there's any common distinction or meaning that helps out. Notice that if you have this is the only time the word's there, it may be only one particular form. It may be a noun from a root, and the root has other nouns, but the other nouns are found more often, and this noun alone is found only once. So you have to watch for that. Take evidence from cognate languages. Look at Ugaritic, look at Akkadian, look at Arabic, and see if there's any help there to determine meaning. But be careful, because we are dealing with a totally different language. It's, we have a lot of Spanish borrowed into English, especially in the western United States. But you will find many Spanish-speaking people very dismayed with the way we have abused their language because we take a Spanish word and use it for a meaning that they don't use it for. That happens in many languages, so be very careful. Question someone had. Yes, go ahead.
Is there a place for examining an extra-biblical Hebrew? Maybe if that word appears in extra-biblical literature?
Right. There's very little ancient Hebrew outside the biblical text. There are a few places, and yes, you do well to look at it. For example, the Gezer tablet is a good place to look at ancient Hebrew that dates back to about the 8th or 9th century BC. And to look at how words are used there might be a help. Or how they're used perhaps at Serebet el-Kadim in the Sinai Peninsula, where the Egyptian mines were and where they used Hebrew slaves and their inscriptions on the walls. That could also prove to be of help. To come to more recent Hebrew, down to Mishnaic Hebrew and first century Hebrew and into modern Hebrew, may put a spin on it we don't want to put on it because language changes and vocabulary changes over time. Just take the word gay in English as an example, how it's changed just in 100 years or less. So we have to be cautious about taking a later form of the language and imposing the meaning back on the older. It'd be like us calling the gay 90s the homosexual revolution. I don't mean 1990s, where it might be true, but the 1890s. All right? You can't impose that meaning back on that word. That's an anachronistic meaning for the 19th century. So be careful what you use, even from Hebrew outside of Scripture. Context. I can't say that strongly enough. It's the 500-pound gorilla in the room. It's just like in doing real estate. Context, context, context. Like in real estate, location, location, location. So context is your best ally in studying those words. Let's take one of them, for example. Let's take the word pilada. The asterisk in Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament beside it tells us that that exact form of the word is not found in the Hebrew Bible. That is a hypothetical absolute form. Or pilda, also not found in the Hebrew Bible. Or palda, also not found in that form in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible uses it in the form of the feminine plural, piladot. That's the only form of it found in the Hebrew Bible. It is a hapax legomenon found in Nahum chapter 2, verse 4. The meaning is in question. It's usually taken from the Persian pulad. So here we have the hypothetical, and here we have the cognate evidence. Persian, pulad, meaning steel. Syriac, bulad or pulad. The Arabic, fulad, all of them meaning steel. See Gesenius Buell lexicon, see Zorel's lexicon, and you find out the various options for meaning. And the Masoretic text has Be'esh Peladot Harekev. Now that would be normally taken as with fire, something, the chariot. As a fiery chariot. A few medieval Hebrew manuscripts and Symmachus have Ka'esh instead of Ba'esh. Instead of with or in fire, as fire. Potential translation, their chariots are like the fire of smelters of steel. And then you can compare it with various commentaries who repoint the text to make it pal or make it from a different form. Instead of piladot, pildot, from pal, the steel fittings on the chariots flash like fire. You can look at Dahoud in the Journal Biblica in volume 51 in 1970 on pages 396 and 397, and he says that piladot is from the Ugaritic palad, cloth, overlay, or carpet. And in Biblia et Orientalia, Dietrich Loretz says that it also has that meaning. Similar Keller in a German commentary on the Old Testament, volume 11, part B, page 121. And then, last of all, a conjectural emendation is offered by Kohler and Baumgartner, the editors of Hebrew and Aramaic Lexicon of the Old Testament. And they refer us to the first edition, KBL, and also to Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensis and the editor of Nahum 2:4, who took the same position and says it should be Ka'esh lapidot, not, notice it's a totally different word, not pildot, but take out the lamed entirely and make it a totally different word. In fact, put the lamed at the beginning. Switch the letters. A transposition of letters. So the end result is that the editors of the lexicon and the editors of BHS, the editor of BHS, of Nahum, has determined that they should change the text because they can't figure out what the meaning is. Gentlemen, never, ever, ever mess with the text on the basis of our ignorance. Wait for better evidence and information and just admit this is a word we're not certain of the meaning. And that's all we should say about it. We don't need to say anything else. We don't need to solve it. We can say it's possible it's referred to steel. We can say it's possible that refers to cloth or overlay or carpet, but that's as far as we can go. It is a hapax legomenon. Deal with it cautiously, and don't choose to change the text just because we don't know the meaning. There are a lot of meanings of words that get lost in antiquity. Another one, tsephah. The etymology is uncertain. Is the primary noun. It's a hapax legomenon in Isaiah 14:29, perhaps meaning a poisonous snake, a viper. Some translate it as a cossatrix. Others translate it as something else. Bodenheimer in his Ancient Life says it's vipera xanthina, a type of poisonous viper. Also, Yohanan Aharoni in his book on the animals of the Bible reaches the same conclusion. And Wildberger in his commentary, German commentary, volume 10, on pages 573 and 581 on the book of Isaiah, concludes that it has the meaning of an otter, which seems very, very different, right? Fascinating, huh? Context answers the question. O Philistines, all of you, do not rejoice, because a rod being broken or shattering will shatter, striking you. Because, and then we have here Mosheresh, from the root of Nachash. There's no doubt about this. Nachash means serpent. from the root of the serpent it goes out. Tsephah, Yetzei, Tsephah. Here, from the root of the serpent, the Tsephah goes out. Notice the Zakef Katon there. The Tsephah goes out. And its fruit, Saraf Me'ofaith, is like a fire, literally a fiery, flying serpent. Now that tells you right away, the parallelism in the context tells you this is not an otter. It is some kind of serpent or snake or viper. Stay with the context. Don't get creative and find a totally new meaning.